want to prove. You know that I wanna lose. He ain't gonna leave this here. This why he ain't gonna be that year. Yeah, that's too sincere. I don't really think I could be that clear. I'ma be right here, but y'all know that. Wanna feed my fist, try to hold me back. Y'all do that, try to hold me down. Karma is real and it's coming around. Yeah, we done came too long, and we ain't backing down, no. We rising up. We rising up. Yeah, now look it up. We rising up.
What is going on, everybody? Welcome to A League Not Forgotten, Stories from the Negro Leagues. This is our inaugural first episode, and we have an amazing first guest for you guys, Mr. Bob Kendrick himself, president of the Negro League Museum. Bob, how are you doing?
Brandon, I'm great, man. It's so good to be with you, and I think I am tremendously honored that I'm your inaugural guest on this show. I can tell you now, though, there's no place to go but up.
Well, our second guest, we do have an episode ready for next week as well. Our second guest is Pete Gorton of the Donaldson Network.
Oh, yeah.
So,
Dear friend, and a wonderful researcher and someone who has dedicated his life so greatly to making people understand how great John Donaldson was.
absolutely, and that's something that we're going to talk about in a little bit here, because I want to kind of reference the work that he does to maybe see what can be done for other players in the future. But before we really get into what the Negro Leagues was, can you tell me a little bit about how you got started with them?
It's an incredible story in its own right because, Brandon, I started as a volunteer with the museum in 1993. Who knew that
Yeah.
you go from being a volunteer to ultimately trying to lead what I believe to be one of the greatest social justice, civil rights institutions in the world, that being the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum. And for me, my involvement happened by happenstance. I was working for the Kansas City Star at the time in its promotions department, the daily newspaper, and the promotions department functioned as the Star's in-house advertising agency. And I drew the assignment of promoting the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum's first ever traveling exhibition. This was in 1993, an exhibition called Discover Greatness. That exhibit is still touring the country almost 32 years later.
That's incredible.
It's incredible. And so I didn't even know there was a Negro Leagues Baseball Museum. And it was literally just right down the street from the Kansas City Star. So I said, well, I better go down and find this museum so I can do a little bit of background research work so I can put the promotional campaign together. I park in front of the Lincoln Building. I go up to the third floor of the Lincoln Building, and I'm looking for this museum, and I can't find it. And I finally peek my head in a room, and the late Don Motley, who was the executive director of this museum, this fledgling Negro Leagues Baseball Museum at that time. And I peeked my head in, I said, well, I'm looking for the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum. And he looks up at me and he smiles. He says, son, you're standing in it. It was just this one room office, had some photographs on the wall, a few boxes with memorabilia. And that was my introduction to the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum. Little did I know that when I walked into that one room office, I literally walked into what would become my passion. I fell in love with this museum. I fell in love with this mission, and I fell in love with the amazing players who made this history. And as a baseball fan, I realized how little I knew about the history of this game and its connections to the history of this country. And I just wanted to learn as much as I could, and I didn't want to keep it to myself. I wanted everyone to feel the way that I felt about it. And then I met the late, great Buck O'Neil. And as I've oftentimes said, once you're bitten by the Buck bug, oh man, it's a wrap. You just wanted to be on Buck's team. But Brandon, I never saw this turning into a career.
Right.
I just wanted to support the museum in any way I could. I started volunteering with the museum, and lo and behold, as fate would have it, it turned into a career. And one of the most gratifying things that I think I could have done either personally or professionally, I became the museum's first director of marketing in 1998. And then, of course, in 2011, was named president of the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum.
That's incredible. Kind of similar, I got my start volunteering in radio, and we were at 16 years old in 2004, and we were in a broom closet in the high school. And by the time I left there 7 years later, we had built our own station building. So, it's just crazy how things, evolve. And then, of course, I went on to do all sorts of things over the next 20 years. And now I'm really focusing on baseball and YouTube, because that was really my passion from the beginning. And like you said, the last 2 years, getting really into the Negro Leagues, of course, because of what you guys have done with MLB The Show, I'm realizing how little I knew. When I kicked on that first storyline, I knew what the Negro Leagues were because of Ken Burns baseball. I knew of Satchel Paige, and I knew of Josh Gibson, but that was about it.
Yes.
Other than Jackie Robinson.
Exactly.
And of course, everybody knows Jackie's story.
But if I find it so interesting, they know Jackie, but so many don't know that Jackie came out of the Negro Leagues.
Right.
That's so eye-opening to them, because they understand the significance of his barrier-breaking role in our game, but they seemingly had no real knowledge that it all began in the Negro Leagues, as if Jackie just walked out of nowhere and started playing for the Brooklyn Dodgers, but he plays here in 1945. And I was no different than you. I knew the name Satchel Paige, Josh Gibson, Cool Papa Bell, because those are transcending names. Baseball fans have likely heard of those names. Now, Brandon, they may not know just how good they were, but you've likely heard those names. But man, I had no idea about the breadth, the depth, the scope, the magnitude that these leagues had both on and off the field. And it was an absolute awakening for me.
Right. And like, even with what you guys are doing with MLB The Show is just the tip of the iceberg. I began to dive into it. I then, of course, found your podcast, Black Diamonds, that I've listened to countless hours of, some episodes over and over again, just because I'm the kind of person that when I become obsessed with something, I want to learn and I want to absorb all of that knowledge. So these last 2 years have been just incredible. The amount of stuff that I've learned that I didn't even know existed.
Yeah.
And it's largely because of the work that you are doing with the folks over at San Diego Studios, which is incredible. But I want to talk about the stat integration, because that's another big thing that has happened. I think that is one of the most fantastic, things to happen. I want to get your take on it. How do you feel about how that's gone?
It was epic. It was epic in so many ways, because as a cultural institution like the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum, part of our long-range goal is to hopefully rewrite the pages of American history books so that this story is included. It had been omitted. And so countless generations of us went through our own formal education without knowing one of the most significant chapters, not in just baseball history, but in American history. And what Commissioner Rob Manfred, Commissioner of Major League Baseball, did, number one, going back to December of 2020, December 16th, to be specific, when he made the historic announcement that, first and foremost, Major League Baseball was going to recognize the Negro Leagues for what we already knew it to be, a major league, and that it would then roll in the statistics of the Negro Leagues into the record books of Major League Baseball. That was monumental. Well, 3.5 years later or so, this dream team of Negro League historians, researchers, they did the lion's share of work. I was part of that committee. Now, let me tell you, Brandon, I did no research. No. They didn't need me messing it up with my research capabilities. All that credit goes to them, but I was so honored to be a part of that. And with one swipe of the pen, Major League Baseball essentially rewrote a portion of the pages of American history books. Because, man, I had always said that had the doors opened sooner, the record books in Major League Baseball would be entirely different. So what does baseball do? It reopened the door. And now the records are different. And I know some folks feel some kind of way about the fact that now Josh Gibson's name is ahead of Ty Cobb as the, all-time batting record holder, 372, and single season batting record of 466, which I'm going to go out on a limb and say that ain't going to be broken. And of course, he's numero uno in on-base percentage. And you're seeing these other names that many baseball fans did not know. But just because you don't know who they are, don't mean they couldn't play.
Exactly.
And so it meant a great deal to me for this museum, for the surviving Negro League players, and for their families to get this level of historical atonement, I guess you could say. And the record books were almost secondary for me. It was that historical validation, because the Negro League players were never seeking validation because they knew how good they were. And Brandon, they knew how good their league was. And quite frankly, the major leaguers knew how good they were. But for historical validation, this meant a great deal, because what a lot of people didn't know is that there were other professional baseball leagues that were running parallel to the National and American League that were already recognized. The Negro Leagues, they hadn't been omitted, they had been blatantly disregarded. And Commissioner Manfred did what other commissioners could have done, and they didn't do it.
Exactly.
And it changed things dramatically.
Yeah, and that's what I debate with people all the time when I see people say that, keep Major League Baseball to the NL and AL and, keep the stats quote unquote pure. They like to say things like that. And my rebuttal is always, okay, well, you have to go back to 1969 to do that then. Because there were, several other white leagues that, frankly, nobody's heard of.
Exactly, that are in there. The Federal League and all these other leagues and then when you think about it, Brandon, those leagues had very little impact on Major League Baseball. The Negro Leagues had dramatic, sweeping impact on Major League Baseball, because as you started to siphon out this talent from the Negro Leagues, Major League Baseball got better. When it opened its doors to those black and brown players, the game was better. And it is evident by the fact that, and I love to quote this, from 1949 to 1959, 9 of 11 National League MVPs were former Negro League stars. Now, we're not even talking about rookies of the year. We're talking MVPs. And of course, as you know, the American League was just so slow to integrate. The American League didn't want a black player. They came really kind of resisting the black player. And so Elston Howard would eventually become the first black MVP in the American League. But the National League was far more aggressive in signing its black talent. And you could see the polar shift in what happened in All-Star games and eventually World Series. And the National League was the pace of the play. Everything was just polar different than the American League. And so it had an immediate and dramatic impact on how this game was played. And so to somehow try to rationalize that the Negro Leagues were an inferior league to its white counterpart makes little sense. Matter of fact,
Absolutely.
What's that?
Yeah. So that's the other part that I want to touch on when it comes to the stat integration, because the other thing that I see a lot of people argue is they'll say that, I'm going to use John Donaldson and Rube Foster as the examples here. They'll say they aren't as good because when you look at their baseball reference, they only have partials of a couple of seasons that are recognized within the stats that were, placed, not realizing that a lot of their playing time either came before the official Negro Leagues, or in the case of John Donaldson, outside of the Negro Leagues. He was playing here in my home state of Minnesota in independent leagues. But, the baseball stats that we have only do so much. And that's where I wonder, can we is there any chance that we get the efforts of somebody like Pete Gorton, who has done this great work for John Donaldson, with some of these other players?
Yeah, well, you think about the work that Pete has done. And I mean, this work has been monumental. The man has dedicated so much of his life to it. And so, because a lot of times, one of the things that people would use to try and justify their position that the Negro Leagues was somehow a secondary league is that they would say, well, we don't have the stats. We don't have the statistics to back it up. This is lore. This is folklore. This is legend. So what does Pete do? He goes out and dedicates decades, he and his team of researchers, to pulling all these numbers together. I mean, these numbers are straight out of a video game. Over 400 verifiable wins, over 5,000 strikeouts, all these other incredible feats, and they're still unearthing stuff. So that gives you an indication of the challenge that it was to do this. And then what did people say? Well, that was against lesser competition. So the finish line would always move. And I was so disappointed that John Donaldson did not get enough votes to be inducted into Hall of Fame. John Donaldson is one of the greatest pitchers, black or white, to ever take the mound. And lost in those almost mythical like numbers that he compiled as a pitcher is people forget that John Donaldson was a great all-around ball player. Do you hold the fact that he could only play against who he was allowed to play against? If he could have played in the major leagues, he would have dominated in the major leagues if he'd been given an opportunity to do so. So you can't hold against him the fact that he didn't play with what people want to believe was the greatest talent in the world, because you don't know that for sure. You have no way to really know that. And so John Donaldson could only compete against the people that he was allowed to compete against, and he dominated them. He absolutely dominated them. This is the man that invented the slider. All these amazing feats that this is not hyperbole. This is documented and substantiated, and it still doesn't get enough credence to get this man into the National Baseball Hall of Fame, then take out every 19th century player that's in there.
No, it really doesn't. And, one thing, being from Minnesota, prior to talking to Pete, I had no idea that he played here for so long.
Long time.
And in our conversations, the talk about where I currently live, Duluth, came up because in 2016, I directed a film about the lynchings that happened here in 1920. And I live a couple of blocks away from the monument that has been resurrected for those three gentlemen. And Pete told me a story about how, like, 4 years to the day after that, John Donaldson was pitching in Duluth on a, independent league team. And many of the people who participated in this lynching were probably in the audience cheering him on. And it's just this polar,
this
just weirdness about how.
But that's race in this country.
Yeah,
that's
just something that's resonated with me, and is
you still get that today. You get those who behind the scenes are doing these heinous things, but they're cheering on these black players who are playing football and basketball. That makes absolutely no sense.
No, it does not.
But that is the nature of racism. It is the nature of what a Jim Crow society was like. And I think Pete is absolutely right in hypothesizing that likely took place. They were likely there cheering him. And it's just amazing. But that's also why you have a Negro Leagues Baseball Museum to continue to try and amplify these players so that people will hopefully, again, appreciate just how good these athletes were. We carry two posters that I'm fond of in our museum. One of the headlines says 440 feet is 440 feet, no matter what color your skin is. And the other says, just because they weren't in the same league as Babe Ruth and Ty Cobb doesn't mean they weren't in the same league as Babe Ruth and Ty Cobb. Or as my friend, the late great Buck O'Neill, who would say it so poignantly and so succinctly, we could play, and they could play. And we keep trying to find a narrative to diminish how good these players were, and we keep trying to refute that, and we'll continue to do that to amplify who they were, not just as ball players, but also as citizens and their contributions to this country.
Mm-hmm. And the last thing that I want to say about John Donaldson is that if you need to know how great this man was, you can look no further than the fact that Satchel Paige, who anybody who, even the fan with the most minimal knowledge about the Negro Leagues, know that Satchel idolized John Donaldson.
He idolized John Donaldson. That was who he wanted to be. And some of the antics that we celebrate Satchel for having done in games, John Donaldson was doing that well before that. And when J.L. Wilkinson, the owner of the great Kansas City Monarchs, when he says that John Donaldson is the greatest pitcher he ever had, I want you guys to understand, who's listening to the show, the context of that. Because John Donaldson had Hall of Fame pitcher, and who many believe to be the greatest pitcher of all time, Satchel Paige, Hall of Famer Hilton Smith, Hall of Famer Bullet Rogan, Hall of Famer Jose Mendez. And he says unequivocally, John Donaldson is the best he ever had. Now, keep in mind, John Donaldson made a lot of money for J.L. Wilkinson. So Wilkinson's sentiment might have been, a little bit more embellished, but I think he sincerely meant it. And it is a tremendous way to kind of at least glean how good John Donaldson was, because if you remotely draw a comparison to Satchel Paige, then you're great. But to be considered better than Satchel Paige, well, that is extraordinary.
Exactly. So moving on to the innovator, Rube Foster, what can you tell me about his pre-Negro League career? Because he had two great seasons in 1905 and 1906 that I was looking up and looking into from the little bit that we can see on those seasons. And then, of course, he was the man to start what we became to know as the Negro League. So what can you tell me about him and that stuff?
Well, he is the rarest of baseball figures, Brandon, because Rube Foster would have gone in the Hall of Fame as a player, as a manager, and as an executive. And you don't find many, if any, that check all three boxes. He had been a dominating pitcher himself in the early era of black baseball. As a matter of fact, he is credited with having invented what we now know to be the screwball. And he dominated opposition, including major league opposition, with this pitch. Back then, it was known as a fadeaway. And he perfected that pitch so much so that the great major league manager, John McGraw, would sneak Rube into his camp so that Rube Foster could teach Christy Matheson how to throw the screwball. Christy Matheson, y'all, threw the pitch all the way into the National Baseball Hall of Fame that he learned from Rube Foster. Now, he was best known as a visionary, tremendous leader. And you're right, he would organize the Negro Leagues here in Kansas City in a meeting held at the Paseo YMCA. Some of you may know that we are working diligently to save that historic landmark, and that is going to be converted into the Buck O'Neill Education and Research Center. And then we're building a brand new Negro Leagues Baseball Museum, or at least plans to build a brand new Negro Leagues Baseball Museum right there adjacent to the historic landmark that Rube Foster established the Negro National League on February 13th, 1920, having convinced 7 other independent black baseball team owners to give up their independency and become an organized body, because the belief was for black baseball to survive and thrive, it needed to have an organized structure that would be mirrored right after Major League Baseball. Rube was masterful in getting that done. And he would stand there at the Paseo YMCA, right around the corner from where we are, here at the Negro Leagues Museum, and he would proclaim, "We are the ship, all else the sea." And it was the Negro Leagues Declaration of Independence. They were sending notice to Major League Baseball that a new player had arrived on the scene that was going to be needed to be reckoned with. They won't have to deal with us. And he was brilliant. He was so far forward in his thinking that he thought he could create a league that would be so dynamic that he would force Major League Baseball's hand to expand. And think about this. This is what happened with the merger of the NFL and the AFL. That's how we get the Kansas City Chiefs here in KC now. They were the Texans at one point in time, and then when the merger, the Chiefs come here. Think about the merger of the NBA with the ABA. And for those of you who are basketball fans, San Antonio Spurs, Denver Nuggets, Indiana Pacers. The Brooklyn team was formerly the New Jersey Nets. Those were ABA teams. And the merger occurred. Rube Foster was thinking about this, Brandon, in the 1920s. That's how brilliant this man was. And of course, the style of play that he dictated. Yeah. See, back then, baseball, well, it's kind of eerily similar to what baseball has become today, a base-to-base kind of game where a guy got on base, the big hitters came up, you moved them over to second, the big hitters would come up and drive them in. Nothing wrong with that. A little boring. But in the Negro Leagues, they were going to drop that bunt. They're going to steal second. They're going to steal third. And man, if you ain't too smart, they're stealing home. He was known to find his ball players at the turn of the 1900s as much as $5. If you were tagged out standing up, you were supposed to slide. He would draw a circle down the first base line and a circle down the third base line. And if every one of his players couldn't drop a bunt inside that circle, he would find them. He was adamant about the style of play that would indeed become signature Negro Leagues baseball: fast, aggressive, daring. And so he just kind of had that it factor when it came to baseball knowledge and how to organize. And he is the mastermind behind the Negro Leagues and its eventual success. And so, yeah, now Rube should be celebrated as one of the game's greatest innovators with what he did in building the Negro Leagues, because others had attempted to do it, but they had failed.
Exactly. And so, you have guys in the Negro Leagues like Satchel, like Gibson, like we've talked about these guys. Can you give me a name of somebody who might be more underrated that you think fans should know of?
Well, the player that immediately comes to mind, and I know it's hard to say that a Hall of Famer is underrated, but in this case, a lot of people don't recognize this name, and that is the name of Martin Dehigo. Yeah, the great Cuban.
I've got the poster right back there. I'm wearing his jersey.
Yeah. Yes.
That he's become my favorite player over the last 2 years.
Yeah, the great Cuban star who nickname, as you know, was El Maestro, the master, because he could do it all. Played all 9 positions. Now, we talk about and we fall in love with this notion of a two-way star. Martin Dehigo played all 9 positions, played all 9 of them well. He is the only baseball player in the history of our sport to be enshrined into 5 different countries' baseball halls of fame. He's in the Mexican, Cuban, Venezuelan, Dominican, and in Cooperstown. I mean, just a marvelous baseball player, or as my dear friend, late great Monty Irvin would say, a beautiful ball player, statuesque. Dihigo was probably 6'3", 6'4", just I mean, a tremendously talented, athletic ball player who also had the smarts to go along with it. He had the mind to understand, and a great arm out in right field, and many say rivaled the arm of Roberto Clemente, which shouldn't be far-fetched because he was a dominating pitcher as well. And so most people who come to the museum, they walk up next to the statue of the guy who's standing there at home plate, because we have him standing at the home plate batting, and they look down at that nameplate and they have no idea who Martin Higo really was. And it's fun to be able to celebrate and also celebrate the connection between the Negro Leagues and Spanish-speaking countries, because as I oftentimes tell my guests, the Negro Leagues didn't care what color you were. All they cared was, can you play? And if you can play, they open up their doors for you to play. And so he is one of, a number of just extraordinarily talented ball players. I like to tell the story of Ted Strong. Ted Strong is not a household name. Ted Strong, though, was Dave Winfield before we ever knew who Dave Winfield was. Ted Strong was about 6'7", 230, 240, freakish athlete, Brandon. Played every position except for pitch and catch. He's a 6'7" shortstop, five-tool guy who many thought would be the player. If you're just looking from it from a talent perspective, many thought that he would be the guy chosen to break the color barrier. Ted Strong, when he wasn't playing for the Kansas City Monarchs, starred for the Harlem Globetrotters. So this is the kind of athlete that we're talking about. Now, Ted Strong's personal demons probably prevented him from getting that opportunity to play next level, and likely prevented him from having a legitimate opportunity to be inducted into the Hall of Fame. But he was at the heart of many of those great Monarch teams in the 40s after he got out of the Navy himself. So that's another name that people, is eye-opening when you start to learn about some of these players.
Yeah, and going back to Dihigo for a second, his lineage in Latin America, they love him down there.
Oh, no doubt. I'll never forget, man. I got to welcome the great Jose Contreras to the museum. He was playing with the White Sox at that time. And I'll never forget when he walked into this museum and he saw his fellow countrymen standing proudly there at the plate, the pride that emanated from him. Because it's hard to come out of Cuba and not know the name Martin Dihigo. Many Mendoza would glow about how good Martin Dihigo was. Louis Tion, the same thing. All talking about how great Martin Dihigo, Tony Perez, many of the other great Cuban ball players, they all recognized. And even if they had been too young to see him play, you can best believe their parents told them about this ball player.
Well, and even now, I work with the Boston Sports Entertainment Network. And a couple of weeks ago, we interviewed Johan Fran Garcia, who is a catching prospect in the Red Sox organization from Venezuela. And we got on the subject of Martin Dihigo a little bit, and his eyes lit up. So, still today, they know and they respect this man. And we talked about how he may be the greatest player of all time, because when you look at, the only other two comps are Ohtani and Ruth was not a two-way player for very long. Great hitter. No, and then Ohtani, is doing things that we presumably have never seen in the MLB. He has only been doing it for 6-7 years. And Dihigo did it for a very long time.
Yeah, and he doesn't play a lot of outfield anymore. But I love the fact that when Shohei came into Major League Baseball, the skepticism around him that he wouldn't be able to do that in the major leagues, and the fact that it opened up an opportunity for them to query about the great two-way stars of the Negro Leagues. And it gave me a chance to talk about the likes of Bullet Rogan, who if you're going to make a comparison to Shohei, Rogan might be the greatest comparison because Rogan, let me put it this way, in the vernacular of Satchel Paige, because only Satchel could say it this way, that Bullet Rogan is the onlyest ball player I ever saw, I ever heard of that pitched and hit in the cleanup position. And folks, you don't just hit cleanup for the Kansas City Monarchs unless you can rate. And when Rogan wasn't pitching, he played the outfield, lifetime batting average well over 300. But here's the thing that is so striking. Shohei is such an imposing athlete. He's a big man. He's 6'3", 6'4", just large in scale and athletic. Bullet Rogan is on the other end of the spectrum. He might be 5'7", 5'8", and as Satchel would describe him, he was a chunky fella, but he was a tremendous athlete who led the Negro Leagues, Brandon, in stolen bases when he was 38 years old. But when you looked at him, you didn't see this great athlete. And Buck says on the mound, he had what he would describe as a heavy fastball. But he threw a palm ball, he threw a curve ball. He could get it up there in a hurry because his nickname was Bullet. And he threw from a no wind-up delivery. And his nickname was Bullet. Yeah, he just stood there and that thing just shot out of his hands and just was an extraordinary ball player, Leon Day. And Buck O'Neil swore to the day that he died that Leon Day was a better center fielder than he was pitcher. And folks, he's in the National Baseball Hall of Fame as a pitcher. And again, his former teammate, the late great Monty Irvin, said, if you never saw Leon Day pitch, but you saw Bob Gibson pitch, then you saw Leon Day. He said Gibby had nothing on Leon Day, and that is an amazing testament to how good Leon Day was. And Leon Day played every position except for catcher. He was an extraordinary athlete who doesn't get enough attention for his two-way prowess. And there were so many others in the Negro Leagues. And a lot of it, Brandon, was out of necessity because their roster sizes weren't as large as the Major Leagues roster. So you're not going to have a 4 or 5 man dedicated pitching staff because you don't have the 25-man roster like you did in Major League Baseball. So the roster sizes in the Negro League is going to be 15, 18. So you needed versatility. So the players, those pitchers had to hit. Now, Satchel wasn't much of a hitter, but Satchel going to earn his right on the mound. Because he, as he would tell Buck, he said, he called Buck Nancy. He said, Nancy, just get me one. If you get me one, I got the rest of it. So, and so when Satchel got a hit, he was going to let you know he got a hit. But Hilton Smith was a dominating pitcher in the Negro Leagues. Hilton Smith, some believe, had the greatest curveball the sport has ever seen. He did something that I don't think we'll ever see done in this game again. He won 20 games or more, 12 consecutive years. And he was dominating at that time. But he was on the same pitching staff with Satchel Paige. And Hilton Smith, Brandon, was the polar opposite of Satchel Paige. When Satchel walked in the room was going to light up. You knew he was in the room. And if you didn't know he was in the room, he was going to let you know that he was in the room. But Hilton Smith was the polar opposite. Quiet, unassuming, workmanlike, but just as lethal. But when he wasn't pitching, he played the outfield, lifetime batting average of over 300. It is in the National Baseball Hall of Fame, of course. And so there were a litany of great two-way stars in the Negro Leagues, and I have to thank that phenom by the name of Shohei Ohtani for opening up the door and the opportunities for us to bring them to the forefront.
Mm-hmm. Now, moving into some Jackie Robinson talk, and I want to take this a slightly different way than I think a lot of people would approach this, because we all know the story of how Jackie did what he did. You have a great 2-part podcast on why Jackie.
Yeah.
But I want to ask you, in kind of a different light, what was so great for baseball I'm going to throw Larry Doby into this conversation as well, in Jackie Robinson and Larry Doby breaking the color barrier in their respective leagues, was kind of the first nail in the coffin for the Negro Leagues. So what can you tell me about that?
Yeah, that was going to be the byproduct of progress, or certainly what was deemed progress. It was the first salvo. There's no question that Jackie's breaking of the color barrier is what started the path for the demise of the Negro Leagues, because what it did was it opened the doors for other black and brown players to move into the major leagues, and you had this pool of talent that was there in the Negro Leagues. And so as they are being siphoned out, there was no replenishing system in place. And at some point, if you were an aspiring young black or brown player, you no longer needed the Negro Leagues, because now integration has occurred and you can bypass the Negro Leagues, go straight to the major leagues, minor league system, or directly into the major leagues. And so it ultimately led to the demise of the Negro Leagues. So this would, some would say, unintended consequences. Others might theorize that it was intended consequences, but it was going to be difficult for two leagues to operate parallel once the door opened. And of course, the Negro Leagues were no longer in a position that they could develop these players. I do think that a few Negro League teams thought that they might become kind of an extension of the majors minor league system. They would serve as a feeder system to these major league teams. They already had their own minor leagues. They were never going to do that. And yeah, it did. It put the Negro Leagues out of business. And the story is really even deeper, because it also disenfranchised a lot of African American communities who had been so dependent on the clientele that was being produced by the Negro Leagues that supported what I then call segregated, mandated Black-owned businesses. And so in general, wherever you had successful Black baseball, you typically had thriving Black economies. With the integration of our game, which also spawned the integration societally in a major capacity, all of a sudden, those smaller Black businesses can no longer compete with their mainstream counterparts, and they perished. And so it was progress on one hand, particularly from a standpoint of being morally right. It was devastating economically. And again, as I tell my guests, there is always a cost for progress, always. Today, it is more technological in nature, but with each technological advancement, what happens? Someone loses their job. But this was good for the soul of our country. It moved us in ways socially we never dreamt possible, but it absolutely came at a cost.
Yeah. And when you think of, like you said earlier, how they almost became farm systems, but they didn't. But in a way that they did early on, because guys like Hank Aaron, Willie Mays, Ernie Banks began to just get plucked after short service time in the Negro Leagues. But the last thing that I really want to touch on about the end of the Negro Leagues is not only that, but what it opened up to for Tony Stone and maybe Peanut Johnson and people today who will say, well, when are we ever going to see a woman in baseball, realizing that we already have?
Yeah, we already. That's the same thing. I hear that question posed all the time. Well, one day we'll see a woman playing professional baseball. No. The one day has already occurred. We've already seen women play professionally in the Negro Leagues. We're waiting for it to happen again. But the thing that you just mentioned, this immense talent, Henry Aaron, Willie Mays, Ernie Banks, who got plucked out of the Negro Leagues, young ball players who developed into superstar major league players. But here's the thing, Brandon, they got those players for pennies on the dollar. Yeah, they got them for pennies on the dollar. These are future Hall of Famers. Please understand that Branch Rickey never paid for Jackie Robinson. He took Jackie Robinson away from the Kansas City Monarchs. Now, Bill Veeck did pay Effa Manley for Larry Doby. He initially came offering $5,000. And Mrs. Manley wrote back and said, now, Mr. Veeck, if Larry Doby was right, he'd be worth over $100,000. But if you think this sum is fair, I guess I have no other recourse but to relinquish. Because she understood, she fought Branch Rickey off of Monty Irvin. But she knew that she wasn't going to be able to continue to fight these owners off of these players. As I say in the podcast, there was blood in the water and the sharks were coming. And so Bill Veeck writes her back and says, I tell you what, I'll give you another $5,000 and I will give a $5,000 signing bonus to Larry if he makes the team. That is what then opens the door for these Negro League owners to sell their star players to the major leagues. Branch Rickey essentially refused to pay. He didn't think that the contracts of the Negro Leagues were valid and that by them being in separate leagues, that he was more than free to go sign these players, although they were legally bound to their Negro League franchises. But essentially, that opened the door for those Negro League owners to start selling their star players to the major leagues. But man, to think about, you likely got Henry Aaron and Willie Mays for $15,000. Like, are you kidding me?
Stuff like that is absolutely crazy. And first, really quick, I want to thank you for having this conversation with me. And I want to ask you a few MLB The Show questions before we get out of here. But before we pivot there, is there anything else that you want to say on the Negro Leagues?
Well, I think it's important that, and I think to some extent, set the framework for what the Negro Leagues were off the field. And for those who make their way to Kansas City to see the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum, and I certainly hope that you will, you'll see that in some ways we de-emphasize the players in lieu of the story, a story that had escaped the pages of American history books. Because I think for us, it is a given that when you walk through this museum, you're going to meet some of the greatest athletes to ever put on a baseball uniform. And you'll hear me really more times than not tout them as great athletes because the more majority of them could have played anything. They just happened to play baseball because baseball was really the primary way to make a living playing a professional team sport. Basketball and football were still seen more or less as a collegiate sport. And so yeah, we almost de-emphasize them because we want you to walk away with an understanding of what the Negro Leagues meant in this country, how it helped advance our country socially, and how it changed things so dramatically. These players in the Negro Leagues not only changed the game of baseball, but they helped change and transform America in so many ways. And really, that's the story that we want you to walk away, hopefully having a much richer, deeper appreciation for that aspect of what the Negro Leagues had represented in our country alongside this immense talent that played in these leagues, but also the great minds behind these Negro League teams from an executive standpoint, as well as the great managers that led these teams, because they don't get as much love, Brandon, as the players.
They do not.
Yeah, as the players do. That's why I was also disappointed that Vic Harris, who was on the ballot with John Donaldson, neither of them got any real consideration for induction into the National Baseball Hall of Fame. Right now, there is not a Negro Leagues manager in the National Baseball Hall of Fame, not just for his managerial career. You've got Buck O'Neil, who did manage, but Buck went into the Hall of Fame as a contributor. Rube Foster went into the Hall of Fame as a contributor. Both of them were brilliant managers, but there's no manager from the Negro Leagues that is in the National Baseball Hall of Fame. And for me, that is a travesty. So we've got to now do more to elevate that aspect of Black baseball so that when these opportunities come up, perhaps they will be given more credence because there are very deserving managers from the Negro Leagues who should also be in the Hall of Fame.
I agree. And you said something earlier that I just want to touch on. Please go see the museum. My dad and I are planning a trip down, hopefully this September, if everything aligns with our schedules. And I'm very excited because that's been somewhere that I've wanted to visit for the past 2 years now. So I'm very excited to get down there and see everything.
I hope you all schedules align and your travels bring you to Kansas City. And you certainly got to make sure you keep me posted because it would be an honor to welcome you and your dad here to the museum.
That's great. Now, before we get out of here, I would be absolutely remiss if I didn't ask you a couple of MLB The Show questions because MLB The Show is so pivotal for my Negro Leagues journey and the journey of so many others. So to start, what can you tell me about how this partnership with MLB The Show has impacted the Negro Leagues Museum?
Oh, I can't even overstate the immense impact that a video game has had on this museum. Brandon, it is by far the biggest thing this museum has ever done. And again, guys, this is not hyperbole. It is fact. Because to be honest, I think I was a little naive. I knew we were doing something cool. And I've always wanted the Negro Leagues to be included in the video game. And MLB The Show is the biggest baseball video game in the world. But I had no idea just how big the gaming platform really is. And so once we were able to accomplish this, thanks to Ramon Russell and the folks over at San Diego Studios, to see so many young people and young adults who have just been blown away by a piece of history that I'm not sure they would have thought about otherwise. And they are not only learning about the Negro Leagues, but they are falling in love with the Negro Leagues. And they're falling in love with the stories that I'm sharing in the video game. And that too has blown me away because I saw myself doing a lot of things I never dreamt that I would be in a video game. And man, this game has turned me into a household name in the gaming community. But we've seen so many kids and others who are gamers who have now purposefully made their way to visit the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum because they saw the museum in the video game. And Brandon, they want to meet the guy that's telling the stories in the video game.
Well, and I love this story. You got to tell me the story about the kid on your tour. That's one of my favorites.
Because it touches my heart, and I tell the story every chance that I get. I was leading a tour of some guys who were considering becoming investors. Of course, we're working on an initiative to try and bring expansion Major League Baseball to Nashville. The team will be called the Nashville Stars after the old Negro Leagues team that operated there years ago. It'll be the first time ever that a Major League team carried the name of a Negro Leagues team. So I'm taking them on a tour of the museum. We get out onto the field of legends where the life-size statues of those Negro League players are, and they're cast and positioned as if they were playing a game. So I'm going through the litany of introductions, position by position. And I get to Satchel. And I'm telling my Satchel Paige stories. And in the video game, folks, Satchel is the only pitcher, black or white, who has names for his pitches, because Satchel actually did name his pitches. You know, the other pitchers got fastball, curveball, changeup, slider, you choose from, but not Satchel. Satchel had the midnight creeper. He had the two-humper. He had the bat dodger. He had the hesitation pitch. He had the long tom, the short tom, the jump ball, the trouble ball, the radio ball, the wobbly ball, the dipsy-do. And he had a pitch that he famously called his B-ball. And as I would typically do, I would always pose to my guest, do you know why he called it the B-ball? And Brandon, when I raised the question, a young white kid, he's standing on the third base line on the field of legends with his dad. He couldn't have been more than 9, 10 years old. And he looks at me, he raises his hand, he sticks out his chest. He said, Mr. Kendrick, I know why Satchel called it the B-ball. I say, you do? Well, tell the folks why Satchel called it the B-ball. He says Satchel called it the B-ball because Satchel says it bees where I want it to be when I want it to be there. And I looked at him, I said, man, you must have been playing the show. And his dad looks at me, says, yes, he's been playing the game and he's been paying attention to the stories that you're sharing in the video game. Brandon, that is exactly what we hope would happen. See, there's a misnomer that our young people don't care about history. They do care about history, but it's also incumbent upon me to present history in an engaging and interesting way. And so when we move this into a video game, something that they were accustomed to engaging with, the light bulb clicked on. And
Mm-hmm.
yeah, and they, like I said, they're not only learning, but they're loving. And I mean, how could you not like Satchel Paige? How could you not like the mythical like power of Josh Gibson and the other heroes of the Negro League? So I knew once they were introduced to the players that they would enjoy those players. It surprised me how much they love the stories that I'm sharing in the video game. Yeah, and San Diego Studios was very smart. They didn't just throw the players in and put some stats in, and then you get to put them on your team and that kind of thing. They wanted you to have a backstory about these players. So they put together these very cool vignettes. So you get a killer soundtrack. Here I am telling these stories. So they're not so long that you get bored with them. And I get scores upon scores of letters, emails, text messages, hoping that there will be more stories in subsequent installations of the video game. So we debuted them in 2023 with 8. Last year, there were 10 players in the game. And of course, we will have at least 8 players in the 25 edition of MLB The Show when it is released here coming up soon, early spring when it is released. And so, no, man, this is so exciting and so impactful. More kids have learned about this museum over the last 2 years than over the 30 plus years that we've been operating this museum.
Yeah. Well, and even you look at people like myself, like this inspired me to get involved. And like you said earlier about your own thing, the more you learn about this stuff, the more you cannot keep it to yourself. And you have to, find a medium. For me, it's recording videos and doing research. But you just said something that I want to touch on, that I believe there's a little bit of a misconception within the MLB The Show community, because when you guys debuted this 2 years ago, you said that it was a 5-year partnership. Yeah. And then you reiterated that recently on Baseball Is Dead with Jared Carrabis and Dallas Braden. Yeah. But there's been some people that may have been confused about something you said at the Rickwood Field game where they think that 25 is the last year. So is this still a 5-year commitment?
Still a 5-year commitment.
Okay, so we will for sure get 26 and 27 as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And we hope that it will be extended, beyond
I do too.
that. But right now, contractually, is a 5-year partnership.
All right, well, I just wanted to clear that up. And then I've got 2 more for you. The first one, of course, I know you cannot, say a ton in terms of like giving away the names and things like that, because MLB The Show has yet to reveal these things. Exactly. Don't want to get you any kind of contractual trouble, but is there any, thing that you can tell us that we can get excited about for 25, because those reveals are coming up very soon. And I know the community is kind of itching for any little thing.
Well, I tell you what, there are going to be more great players, and I hope more great stories. I enjoy telling these stories so much, and I hope that people will continue to enjoy these stories. But man, my team over at San Diego Studios, they do such an incredible job with not only coming up with this content that we develop collaboratively, but how beautifully they illustrate this. The stadiums, the way the fans are dressed, everything about this is just top notch. And it's such a long way from when I was playing an Atari back in the day. And so I do think that, I hope that those who are fans of MLB The Show, and particularly storylines, that you're really going to enjoy this next wave of players who will be introduced in the game. I love the fact that while we'll introduce some of those who were superstar players in the Negro Leagues, that there are oftentimes other players who are lesser known, but they were also great players in the Negro Leagues. And you'll see more of that as well. But I am really excited about this next release.
I am too. I around this time of year, I get jonesing for the game in general. So my final question for you, Bob, or more so, I'm gonna give you a story that I would like you to tell. And I've heard this story on Black Diamonds. But I need to ask this for the community itself,
Uh-huh.
because I think a lot of the MLB The Show community who has not found Black Diamonds is still wondering this. It's from the original storylines. It's something you alluded to very quickly, but then the story never came up in the storylines again, and that is why Buck O'Neill's nickname is Nancy.
And we probably don't have enough time to tell that story here. And it was probably a little, see, you see, MLB The Show is, what is that? What's the rating for MLB The Show? It's
Family.
family. Yeah, it's G
Yeah.
rated. Yeah. This story with Satchel and Buck moves just a little bit beyond that, which is why
Yeah.
it wasn't
Yeah.
mentioned in the story. But to make a long story short, old Buck got Satchel was a bit of a ladies' man. The ladies love Satchel, because he's a star. He is a ball player, and he had that swagger. And Buck got his good friend out of a little hot water with a woman named Nancy. And and after that, Satchel nicknamed him Nancy. And yeah, it's such a great story. No one can tell it like Buck did, but they were in
Yeah.
Chicago, and I think Satchel forgot that he had invited his fiancee to Chicago, but he had also invited Nancy to Chicago to see them play. And Buck got his friend out of a little bit of hot water. Buck was Satchel's wingman, and Satchel nicknamed him Nancy from that day forward. But it's just a wonderful story. But we couldn't add that story to the video game.
Right. And I remember when you guys had Buck tell it on Black Diamonds. I love the way he said, that Satchel was knocking on Nancy's door late at night, and the wife came out, and he came out and said, "Are you looking for me?" And Satchel goes, "Yes, Nancy, I am."
Nancy, what time's the game tomorrow? And he was Nancy from that day on. And of course, Satchel and his beautiful fiancee at that time, Lahoma, would get married and raise a wonderful family. And Nancy would go on to do whatever Nancy was going to do. But Buck saved his friend's hide that day.
Yeah. So I just had to clear that up, because I know that many MLB The Show players are probably still wondering.
Yeah,
I
that's
know
that's
I
a
know that I
PG
was.
story. Yeah, that's a
Yeah.
PG story. So we
Yeah.
couldn't put that in the
Yeah.
game.
I was wondering that until I found Black Diamonds, and then when I finally heard that this story's coming up, I was perked up. I was like, okay, here it is. And then I heard it, and I was like, yeah, that's why it wasn't in the game.
That is why it's not in the game.
Bob, I want to say thank you so much for coming on and doing this. This has been an absolute treat to get to talk to you and learn some things that I didn't know, rehear some things straight from your mouth that I did know. But it's just every time I could listen to you tell these stories for days. I often put on Black Diamonds while I'm grinding MLB The Show and just listen and absorb. So
Oh man,
thank you so much.
well, I appreciate that. And for me, this never gets old. I enjoy telling these stories, and I'm so excited that young people like yourselves have taken an interest, and not only taken an interest, but started to advocate on behalf of this history. That means a great deal to me and the museum to have these other foot soldiers out there celebrating this history right alongside us. So we appreciate what you're doing as well.
Thank you. And before we get out of here, is there anything else that you want to add? Anything else that you want to advocate for? The floor is yours.
Well, number one, we hope that all of those who are listening will ultimately make their way to Kansas City and experience the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum. But we also want to encourage you to join our effort to help us build a new Negro Leagues Baseball Museum. The campaign is called Pitch for the Future, and you can learn more about this new 30+ thousand square foot experiential learning museum that we are planning to create on our website at www.nlbm.com. And again, the campaign is called Pitch for the Future. We're super excited about this next phase of growth for the museum, but it's going to take a lot of us pitching in to make this happen. But we'll get there. We will absolutely get there. And so if you're so inclined, please consider making a donation to support the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum.
Well, thank you, Bob. And to all the listeners out there, please like the video, subscribe, share it with people that you think would want to hear these stories. I will have more Negro League stories coming up in the coming weeks. I'm putting some episodes together as we speak. So thank you guys for listening, and we'll see you on the next one.